and welcome back to Read Aloud with me, Dan. Today we're providing context to Mao's 1937 lectures entitled On Practice. And I'm reading from the Encyclopedia of Anti-Revisionism Online, which I just learned about yesterday. And it says, and I don't know too much about this, it says JC, Communist Federation of Britain, Marxist-Leninist, on practice. And it reads, in the study of Mao Zedong's essay On Practice, the intention is not simply to point out the theoretical contribution it makes to Marxism, but to reveal its practical core. That is, the political purposes for which it was developed, by presenting it within the revolutionary context from which it originated. The aim of the study is to guide action, to help solve the problems of revolution, and to provide a framework for ideological unity. This view constitutes an implicit criticism in the first place of a tendency among some high-powered Marxist intellectuals to study in a vacuum, treating theory as a form of class struggle in its own right, independent of practice. By doing so, they not only negate the practical essence of theory, but alienate the masses for whom study is made a burden. This aggravates the opposite and equally erroneous tendency to stress activism at the expense of theory. Mao Zedong's article, On Practice, provides a natural basis for a discussion on the correct approach to this theory, since, on dealing with the Marxist theory of knowledge, it raises the whole question of the correct relationship between theory and practice. Historical context. On Practice was written in 1937, when the Chinese Red Army, having established itself at Yan'an after the Long March, and now in the united front with the Kuomintang, was experiencing a period of respite. There's a lot of history wrapped up in here, guys. It thus took the opportunity of assessing the experiences of the Second Revolutionary Civil War, during which, particularly under Wang Ming's leadership from 1931 to 34, serious political, military, and organizational mistakes had been made. These had disrupted the internal unity of the party, upset political work, and caused grave losses in battle. Although these errors had been criticized in their specific instances, they had persisted because the ideological attitudes of doctrinarism and empiricism, which underlay them, had not been dealt with. On Practice was designed precisely to liquidate these erroneous ideologies. All right. So it's going to go after doctrinarism and empiricism. Wang Ming took the line of left doctrinarism, starting not from a concrete analysis of Chinese actual revolutionary situation, but from an abstract understanding of the class struggle gleaned from random study of Marxist texts. Oppose book worship, Mao says. Oppose dogmatism. He says he followed the principles of socialist revolution mechanically and dogmatically, failing to relate theory to the specific conditions of struggle in China. In the end, he took up policies of positional warfare and urban uprisings, which had nothing to do with the real situation. His abstract and dogmatic approach was masked by a smokescreen of leftist cliches, a king of sloganeering which is just a show of bravado. Such behavior is often typical of petty bourgeois cadres who, coming from an economically unstable class, are unsure of their position and want to prove themselves to be 110% revolutionary. A symptom of what Lenin called the infantile disease of communism. These cadres, desiring a change in their own status, long to race ahead to liberation and often lack the patience for carefully planned strategy or the stamina for a long drawn out struggle. Their policies are based more on their own subjective desire for revolution than on the objective potentialities for it. Accordingly, Wang Ming and his followers were convinced that China was on the brink of socialist revolution, so they pushed ahead with reckless and adventurous military campaigns, blind to the real situations. They ignored their failures and glorified their occasional successes as sure proof that the enemy was in a state of total collapse. Politically, they confused the democratic with the socialist revolution, and regarding capitalism as the main enemy, they insisted on attacking all bourgeois elements instead of uniting with the national bourgeoisie and the rich peasants against imperialism and feudalism. Organizationally, they were utterly sectarian, treating divergers from their line as deadly enemies, substituting abuse for rational discussion, so making discipline a matter of mechanical obedience. These doctrinaires were above all elitists who thought they possessed special gifts which made them born leaders of the revolution. They believed themselves to be infallible instead of seeking the truth from facts, and swaggered and bragged while afraid of just criticism. These so-called Marxist intellectuals made easy ideological captives of many in the party's ranks whose theoretical level was rather low. Doctrinairism exploited the empiricism and those who restricted themselves to their own fragmentary experiences and failed to appreciate the importance of theory for revolutionary practice. The empiricists respected only action, despised theory, and regarded pure experience as infinitely superior to studying Marxism-Leninism. But neglecting to use theory and an understanding of history in summing up the experiences of class struggle. These supposedly practical men, according to Mao, cannot have a comprehensive view of the entire objective process of revolution, lack clear direction and long-range perspective, and are complacent over occasional successes and glimpses of the truth. If such persons direct a revolution, they will lead it up a blind alley. Nevertheless, the hardcore empiricists were elitist and thinking they played the central role in the revolution. They considered that they had innate qualities of perception and understanding, which set their own experiences above everyone else's. Since they put a premium on direct experience, they only had faith in their own subjective impressions and opinions, completely ignoring the experience of the masses. They treated their own limited point of view of the revolution as representative of the whole and failed to realize that direct experience cannot be used as an absolute and unalterable formula for the entire situation, but is always limited by conditions and reflects the situation only partially and one-sidedly. The superficial and subjective understanding of the empiricists meant that they often took accidental or temporary advances or retreats as the essence of the general trend of the whole revolution. Thus, they lacked firm political orientation, and their actions were uncoordinated, unprincipled, and individualistic. To arrive at an objective understanding of revolution in its totality, it must be assessed from all sides in all its respects and conditions. Mao recognized that above all, knowledge of revolution rested on the experience of the masses in all areas of struggle. Doctrinarism and empiricism separated the concrete practice of the Chinese Revolution from the universal nature of Marxism-Leninism. The first, doctrinarism, by isolating the universal element, theory, treating it as an absolute and imposing it on practice, and the second, empiricism, by rejecting the universal element and treating practice as absolute. Mao, on the contrary, affirmed in On Practice the essence of Marxism-Leninism as the theory, as the unity of theory and practice. That from the investigation of particular circumstances, the universal laws of revolution may be derived from summarizing experiences using the analytical tools of history and dialectical materialism. So study is used to guide action, and the unity is ultimately realized by testing the theory's validity through the practice of the masses. On Practice laid the ground for the development of the correct strategy of protracted warfare of a guerrilla nature, determined by the conditions of an uneven development of revolution throughout China and the relative strength of the enemy. It was the correct strategy based on the experiences of the anti-imperialist and anti-feudal struggles, the foundation of a network of class alliances which held in embryo the new democracy of the future. Party unity could then be rebuilt on the basis of an understanding of these struggles and not on blind obedience to discipline. In this way, On Practice dealt with the subjective, one-sided, and individualistic approaches of doctrinarism and empiricism. It provides a lesson in how to think, how to come to know the world objectively and all-sidedly, and to develop correct strategies for changing it, enabling cadres to distinguish genuine from distorted versions of Marxism-Leninism, so helping them to use their initiative in acting in an independent but principled way. Which brings us to the philosophical content. The basic question of all philosophy is that concerning the relationship between thinking and being, between consciousness and matter. On the character of this relationship between our subjective ideas and objective reality, consciousness and matter, hangs the whole explanation of knowledge, and above all, the explanation of our general abstract idea or conceptual knowledge. This goes beyond the immediate individual and sensuous experience of perceptual knowledge to grasp the essence, the causal structure of nature and society. Prior to dialectical materialism, philosophers had not examined the problem of knowledge within the context of man's social nature and his historical development. In a society divided into the masses engaged in productive toil and a leisured and privileged minority freed from such tasks, ideas appear as the result of mental labor divorced from practical activity. Philosophers, as members of the leisured minority, always took the problem of knowledge to be a theoretical issue and sought its explanations in the spontaneous activity of the mind. As a result, consciousness, the subject, appears as divorced from the world, the object, as these philosophers are from production. Thus, they could never adequately explain how knowledge of the real world is possible. That is, how subject and object are interrelated. But just as the existence of these philosophers is entirely dependent on the labor of the masses, so is knowledge in practical activity. The standpoint of life, of practice, should be first and foremost fundamental, is the theory of knowledge. This is the essence of proletarian philosophy. Practice is the socio-historical activity of man directed towards the transformation of nature in accordance with his needs. It is made up of those basic types of human activity on objective and real necessary for man's life as a social being. That's a weird sentence. In the first place, man must struggle to produce from the raw materials of nature goods to satisfy his material requirements. Secondly, he must carry out scientific experiments to develop his productive techniques, giving him control of natural forces to turn them to his own purposes. And thirdly, he must enter into relations with other men to organize production and the distribution of products. In these social relations, I would say objective social relations, men come in contact with each other, not merely as individuals, but as classes based on the division of labor and relations of product exchange, so that social organization involves the class struggle. The struggle for production, scientific experiment, and the class struggle constitute man's life activity. Practice. It must be emphasized that practice is social and historical, and not individual and immediate in character. An individual's practice is part of and determined by the activity of the historically developed society. Chat, what are you thinking so far? You liking this? Come on. Give me some feedback here. What is this making you think of as you read this? Replay viewers, type your thoughts in the comments below. What is this reminding you of? What is this making you think of? Reading on. Knowledge is the reflection in man's mind of the objective processes of nature and society, and is gained through social practice because this alone brings man into contact with things in the world, so that he comes to learn their properties and law of development. Knowledge depends entirely on the three forms of practice. Theory is no fundamental source of ideas because it involves no direct interaction between man and objective reality. Marxists describe the relationship between knowledge and practice, thinking and being, as an identity or unity of opposites. This does not mean that they exactly coincide, but that they are mutually interdependent, determining each other's content. I love the dialectic. Bing bong. Damn it, where's that button? Sorry. He says, in this relation of contradiction, practice is the primary aspect because it is the beginning and the end of the process of knowing. That is, all theory is a generalization from and directed towards the needs of people. For example, astronomy, and with it mathematics, was developed by agricultural peoples because it was indispensable to their way of life. For example, to calculate the seasons.
I love the dialectic.
I found the button. He says, practice is in turn shaped and advanced by the application of knowledge. The development of theory and practice go hand in hand. Production begun on a small scale involving only limited scientific understanding of techniques and giving a restricted horizon on society. But with the all round development of the productive forces, particularly under capitalism, scientific knowledge develops to reflect all the laws of nature in action, to reflect all the laws of matter in action, and the proletarian, the universal class, gain a comprehensive and historical view of the laws of social development. Knowledge is thus inextricably bound up with man's social life, and development and the theory of knowledge should be looked at from the practical point of view and in historical perspective. How then does knowledge derive from practice? All knowledge begins with experience. I think if you're doing this right, you're reading this in the same order that we're reading this here on the stream, in the same way that it should be eventually presented in the playlist. As in, you should be reading this after you read Where Do Correct Ideas Come From. Reading on, he says, all knowledge begins with experience. This is the first step in the process of cognition. Whoever wants to know a thing has no way of doing so except by coming into contact with it. That is, by living, practicing in its environment. If you want to know the taste of a pear, you must change the pear by eating it yourself. If you want to know the theory and methods of revolution, you must take part in revolution. He says, if you want to make a cake, you're going to have to crack some eggs. He says these lines have sometimes been taken as the message of Mao's article. Simple and direct though they are, they have been distorted both by the left, who regard the words of an exhortation to revolutionaries to leave behind their books and study and plunge into the struggle, and by the right, who seek to discredit Mao as a crude philosopher and pragmatist. However, behind the word experience, two different lines may be concealed. Empiricists also say that all knowledge comes from experience. But what is distinctive and revolutionary about Mao's line, that is, the dialectical concept of experience, practice, is that it takes man not to be limited to the role of a passive observer, merely collecting the data of his subjective and one-sided impressions, but as playing an active part in changing reality, grasping things as objects, and thus gaining an insight into their laws of development. While for the empiricist, knowledge remains at the level of immediate reflection of experiences, for the dialectical materialist, this stage of perceptual knowledge is only the first in the process of cognition, which must advance from the superficial understanding of phenomena to the deeper understanding of the essence of things given at the rational stage of conceptual knowledge. The essence. In practice, when man comes into contact with things as phenomena, he sees only the separate aspects of things, their properties, such as color, and external relations, such as comparative size. The task of conceptual knowledge is to select, from the unsystematic collection of accumulated data, the essential elements from the merely accidental ones, so forming a body of judgments which may be tested in practice and developed into a systematic and comprehensive theory. This, then, provides a structure to experience by reflecting the essence and totality of the thing under investigation and revealing its internal laws of development and interrelations with other things. The perceptual and the rational are qualitatively distinct, but they are not divorced from each other. They are united on the basis of practice. In other words, the relationship between the two is both materialist and dialectical. There are many such cases. Firstly, conceptual knowledge is based on perceptual knowledge gained through investigation, which gives various observations under various conditions. For example, from man's discovery at the very beginning of society of how to make fire by friction. That's right. And after many centuries of experiment and of productive practice using various forms of energy, science has formally led to the universal law of the mutual transformation of all forms of matter in motion. Secondly, conceptual knowledge reflects reality more truly and completely than perceptual knowledge. This is because, being more generalized, it's able to reveal the structural essence of things. For example, the law of value, though rarely realized in the determination of a particular price, reflects the true nature of class society. Mao illustrates the two stages of cognition with the example of the proletariat, which at the outset of its struggle against capitalism saw only certain of its phenomena and external relations, and responded with spontaneous acts of machine smashing and burning down factories. After many years of various kinds of economic and political struggles synthesized by Marx and Engels into a coherent theory, the proletariat finally comes to grips with the essence of their exploitation and with an understanding of the laws of society are able to transform it. With that said, we're very much in a stage of consciousness, of cognition within society. Within this society where I live, in the core of empire, there's very little consciousness of the kinds of exploitation that we face here and of the exploitation that we enable our ruling class to do elsewhere. Around the world, because it is empire. So that's sort of what we're doing here, literally on this channel. I'm trying to raise that level of consciousness. We're very much in that phase where we have to raise consciousness. Reading on. A sharp weapon in the hands of the people. Remember, we're not reading Mao right now, for those who aren't aware. We're reading from some English Marxists, written in 1973. We'll read Mao tomorrow. This reads, a sharp weapon in the hands of the people. The Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism has two outstanding characteristics. One is its class nature. It openly avows that dialectical materialism is in the service of the proletariat. The other is its practicality. It emphasizes the dependence of theory on practical emphasis on practice. Emphasizes that theory is based on practice and in turn serves practice. I don't know if there's a typo in there or what. I think that comes from the reading. This article says Marxists do not come to a standstill at the point of acknowledging the existence of objective reality. They do not merely wish to explain the world, but set out to change it. And there's the essence of that Marx quote, the Marx quote again. However, unless they are equipped with a knowledge of the laws of change, people can only remain helpless before the world, leaving everything to fate and submitting with docility to all that happens. It's really what this is all about, you guys. Dialectical materialism is about understanding change so that you can influence change. Change is always happening. You can get into the stream of change and fuck with its internal DNA or something. I don't know if that's a great analogy, but you can change change. What you can't do is make change stop. It's always going to keep changing. But you can morph the fundamental nature of things changing in a certain direction through practice, through the masses. It's pretty fun when you think about it, especially when you realize a lot of things got to change. Oh, they need to change. What it's about. I'm just a broke guy asking you for change. I'm seriously, do you have any money? Reading on. Change. He says, it reads, conceptual knowledge, because it does reflect the objective processes of nature and reality, is the tool of change. That is why dialectical materialism, which of all philosophies is the only one to realize that conceptual knowledge is based on perceptual knowledge, so revealing the objective and materialist core of theory, arms the people in changing the world. To simply acknowledge the existence of the real world, to admit the reality of perceptions, is not true materialism because it omits the essential point of man's interaction with his environment. While perceptual knowledge merely parallels passive experience, conceptual knowledge implies, because it is only made possible by, and in turn makes possible active involvement in changing things. The process of cognition does not end with conceptual knowledge. Theory must submit to the test of truth in practice. It must be put into practice in order to be reformed and further developed. Practice, knowledge, again practice, again knowledge. This unity of theory and practice expresses the mutual transformation of man and objective reality in which man, determined by the material conditions of his life, is able, with theory, to transform reality, and in doing so, transform himself. I like to think I didn't save the revolution. The revolution saved me. The key to the process is practice, because this is the means by which transformation is accomplished, by which subject and object are united. Without an understanding of practice, philosophy has no possibility of explaining the objective content of conceptual knowledge, leaving man paralyzed before the world, divorced from it, so that in the end his life is inexplicable. And that brings us to idealism and empiricism, which I think we've touched on already. We're going to try to save you from empiricist and idealist, opportunist and adventurist despair through study of on practice. This article reads Idealism and Mechanical Materialism, Empiricism. Opportunism and adventurism are all characterized by the breach between the subjective and the objective, by the separation of knowledge and practice. Philosophy, which looks at the problem of knowledge only from the standpoint of theory, failing to appreciate the correct relationship between perceptual and conceptual knowledge on the basis of practice, falls into two schools: idealism and empiricism. Idealism being the opposite of materialism. Empiricism is a form of vulgar or mechanical materialism. It's not Marxist. It pretends to be. In both, objective reality remains beyond the grasp of understanding. Chat, is everybody following? Does anyone have any questions? The empiricists, the mechanical materialists, they think they're doing Marxism, but they're like applying it mechanically, as if you could build a human being with spare parts. Reading on. The empiricists, while saying that all knowledge comes from experience, deny that knowledge is a process involving two stages, that perceptual knowledge must be deepened and systematized into conceptual knowledge, and therefore they ultimately fall short of materialism. For them, the essence of things is laid bare in their appearance to our simple sensations. Thus, they regard the observation of phenomena as the fundamental task of science and effectively attempt to reduce the rational into the perceptual. However, conclusions drawn on the basis of phenomena from data based on perception alone inevitably give rise to subjective, partial, and thus superficial understanding, because they give only a one-sided picture of reality. For example, a wage may appear to be a fair exchange for services rendered, but in fact, the transaction contains the hidden essence of exploitation in the form of surplus labor given to the employer. Hume, the most consistent philosopher in the British empiricist tradition, was aware of the inadequacies of the system. He pointed out that perceptions reflect phenomena singly and thus isolated from and unrelated to each other, so that there is nothing in our experience that gives any indication of necessary and universal relations between the objects of our observation. Empiricism does not show when a relation is a causal one and when it is a mere coincidence. That is, the differences of relation between the striking of a match and the match lighting, and praying for rain and it raining. It thus does not explain general laws as distinct from particular instances, and undermined the basis of science by placing true judgments about objective reality on a par with subjective beliefs. Because it fails to appreciate the qualitative difference between concepts, general ideas, and precepts, sensations, and thereby reduces essence with appearance, empiricism deprives knowledge of any objective content and restricts it to subjective impressions. This amounts to skepticism, particularly since mere observation offers no means of ascertaining whether knowledge reflects reality or not. For the empiricist, in theory, matter is absorbed into consciousness. The objective is taken as directly coinciding with the subjective. Similarly, the empiricists whom Mao opposed in the 1930s in practice reduced the objective to the subjective by taking their personal impressions as universal, neglecting theory, which they assumed to be entirely absorbed ill experience, and failing to take into consideration the experiences of others involved in the struggle, so that they did not understand the revolution objectively in its totality, and were unable to appreciate the relationship between particular experiences and the general laws of revolution. In the sense that empiricism does not recognize the dialectical unity of subject and object based on practice, but merges the one with the other, it provides the basis for the ultra-leftist desire to realize in the present, regardless of the objective conditions, the ideal of the future. In an attempt to preserve the status of science from the alarming conclusion of Hume, Kant developed his complex system of transcendental idealism, a system which amounts to a struggle to unite subject, a rid object, but fails. What? Is that a typo? Is that supposed to be with? It reads, idealists regard experience as far too transitory and unreliable to be the fundamental basis of science. Yeah. On the contrary, I think it must be with. On the contrary, it takes the mind in its autonomous activity as a source of knowledge. It takes the mind as the source of knowledge, the repository of inevitable truths of reason, the only suitable basis for science. In other words, idealism admits only the reality of reason, yet fails to appreciate that reason or conceptual knowledge is only reliable because it is based on perceptions, and quite the reverse of dialectical materialism, it regards scientific laws as the product of the mind imputed to nature. Kant, however, is not a straightforward idealist. Taking this premise of idealism as the basis of his explanation of conceptual knowledge and the empiricist premise that all knowledge comes from experience, to explain perceptual knowledge, he held the elements of dialectical materialism in his hands, yet because he had no conception of practice and thus had no means of uniting the two, he lapsed into dualism. That is, he treated consciousness and matter as fundamentally separate entities. While the structure of our minds provides the conceptual framework of our experience, it always adds a subjective coloring to it, such that we can never know the world as it really is independently of our perceiving. Thus, Kant, having set out to explain how knowledge of objective reality, science, is possible, is faced with the world of the unknowable thing in itself. Thing in itself. I'll provide you with the definition of thing in itself from the curriculum of the Basic Principles of Marxism-Leninism, Part 1, the worldview and philosophical methodology of Marxism-Leninism, translated by Luna Nguyen, thing in itself. The actual material object which exists outside of our consciousness, as it exists outside of our consciousness. Is the definition provided. And there are about 2 or 3 pages of this text that goes over that. Yep. Which I think we'll skip today. Reading on here, Hegel, who achieved the ultimate in idealism, regarded this thing in itself as an absurdity. On the contrary, he declared, there's nothing we can know better, because it expresses the thing in the abstract when we have in thought stripped away all its attributes. Thus, it is a pure product of thought. There is no gap for Hegel between subject and object, because the subject creates the object. Thought creates the laws of the objective world, such that the structural essence of reality is entirely dependent on the structure of our minds. Though Hegel's idealism is hard to take seriously, his formation of the dialectical interrelation between subject and object is an invaluable contribution to philosophy. It's just upside down. Marxism has taken this element, the rational kernel, with a materialism which overcomes the skepticism of the empiricist and Kant's dualism, by answering the problem of whether knowledge reflects objective reality in the following manner. Human action had solved the difficulty long before human ingenuity had invented it. From the moment we turn to our own use these objects according to the qualities we must perceive in them, we put to an infallible test the correctness or otherwise of our sense perceptions. If we find that the object does agree with our idea of it, and does answer the purpose intended for it, then that is positive proof that our perceptions of it and of its qualities so far agree with the reality outside ourselves. While in theory, idealism regards conceptual knowledge as an immutable set of truths fixed in the structure of our minds, divorced from reality. In practice, idealists reduce objective truths to mental ones, which on the one hand are open to revision regardless of objective conditions, and are on the other fixed and unchangeable, so that their thinking lags behind the development of the real situation and takes the form of rightism, which I can't say exactly what they're referring to here. Rightism. Does that mean like a right-wing ideology? I would assume. Reading on. It's worthwhile here to say a word on the charge of pragmatism leveled at Mao. Only the most superficial reading of On Practice could give rise to such an impression. In its philosophical sense, pragmatism serves up the old content of empiricism in a new form. It declares that we may describe the causal structure of nature according to how we wish to explain our perceptions of it. That is, we may adapt our conceptual knowledge or invent laws to suit the needs of our immediate experience. In other words, like empiricism, it denies the objectivity of the laws of science. The position of dialectical materialism is quite the opposite. We cannot freely choose the laws of science. Conceptual knowledge is determined by the way things are in the world, not by the mind. Nor in practice can Mao be said to adhere to pragmatism. For although he's an able tactician, revolutionary policy is for him always a matter of principle, and never to be twisted or sacrificed to suit temporary, individual demands. Lenin remarked that in the sphere of philosophy, revisionism goes back to Kant's dualism. By 1960, a struggle between two lines had emerged in the sphere of philosophy in China. I'm not sure I want to get into this. Let's just read it. This says, when Yang Xianchen, this is Liu Shaoqi's agent in the sphere of philosophy in China, and I'm getting lost in some of these references, sought to undermine Mao Zedong thought, which is like his philosophy, which many misattribute to calling Maoism now. Maoism is something else. It says here, when Yang Xianchen sought to undermine Mao Zedong thought by twisting the fundamental concepts of dialectical materialism. Although he declared himself to be a materialist, adhering to the principle of being is primary, thinking is secondary, he in fact only used this Marxist terminology to mask an attack on materialism. In talking about the identity of thinking and being, Yang Xianchen was careful to interpret this as meaning that social being and consciousness exactly coincided, not that there was any relationship of contradiction which accounted for their interaction and mutual relationship. This interpretation cuts out the objective core of knowledge, opening an unbridgeable gap between consciousness and matter, and severing the relationship between practice and knowledge. By conflating thinking and being, he aimed to deny that the superstructure of society can come into contradiction with its economic base. I love it. I love a dialectical material. I love a superstructure-based superstructure, you know. I love the dialectic.
I love the dialectic.
My favorite button. Reading on, from this position, he, along with the rest of the reactionary world, tried to discredit Mao's line of the People's Communes, which at that time, in 1961 and 62, were experiencing temporary economic difficulties. Yang Xianchen claimed that these superficial setbacks were essential proof that the line of the People's Communes was totally incorrect. Policies, in this view, should immediately and totally succeed, if correct, because theory and practice are identical. Furthermore, this denial in philosophy of the objective content of knowledge, making scientific laws depend on the subjective will, paved the way for revisionism. In practice, they were turning a blind eye to objective reality, ignoring the scientific method of investigation to gain knowledge from the masses and so invent the law of the dying out of class struggle, of backward forces of production and advanced relations of production, which backed their policy of mechanization before collectivization, leading China back to the road to capitalism. Mao Zedong thought, on the other hand, stresses the dialectical element of the phase of cognition that theory and practice develop together. Oh, thank you, Mao. Often correct knowledge can be arrived at only after many repetitions of the process leading from matter to consciousness and then back to matter. What accounts for the initial difficulties which the people's communes underwent was not that the policy was false, but that, due to the subjective and objective limitations, it was incomplete. Theory and practice do not readily conform, and the test of the truth of a theory is not its immediate success, but practice over a period in which limitations are overcome, conditions changed, and theory and practice mutually developed towards conformity. In this way, Mao stressed the need for investigation and the mass line. Successful mobilization of the masses against revisionism did not bring the Cultural Revolution to a conclusion. On the contrary, at this stage it reached a crossroad, for in the struggle against revisionism an ultra-left tendency emerged, particularly among students, which manifested itself in a desire to outstrip the given objective conditions and realize in the present the future ideal of full communism. These leftists were completely carried away by the struggle against the capitalist roaders, which they based not on an investigation of the objective conditions, but on the subjective principles that left is better than right. This must be a typo. This has got to be leaders. Or maybe roaders. People who want to go on the capitalist road. Anyways. For them, Mao Zedong thought became more a series of slogans than a scientific method leading to knowledge. Obsessed by their own experiences in their struggle against the rightist professors and administrators, they tended to exalt their position in the Cultural Revolution, thinking that if they lost the struggle, the whole country would be taken over by the capitalist roaders, I guess, yeah. This type of I am the core thinking leads to arrogance, isolation from the masses, and individualistic actions justified by leftist rhetoric, but in fact based on an utterly distorted and one-sided view of the situation, because it leaves out all consideration of the masses themselves. Thus, the Cultural Revolution constituted not only a struggle against idealism from the right, but against the typically empiricist errors of placing pure action above the study of Marxism-Leninism and rating class sentiment higher than political consciousness. And we reach a conclusion. At the center of the Marxist theory of knowledge as put forward in On Practice lies a two-pronged attack. On the one hand, against right opportunism, and on the other, against left adventurism. As a contribution to theory, On Practice demonstrates a correct relationship between perceptual and conceptual knowledge. The failure to formulate this relationship had been the error of all previous philosophy. But the article provides not only a lesson for philosophers, its essence is of definite practical implications for making revolution. A revolutionary policy does not evolve out of the heads of a few clever leaders, but is based on an investigation of objective conditions and integrally connected with the struggle of the masses. In thus giving first place to practice, revolutionaries must not fail to attach importance to the guiding role of theory. They must never totally immerse themselves in a single practical task and lose sight of the comprehensive and systematic view of the whole situation given by summing up the experiences of the masses. On practice, while occasioned by a particular struggle, contains the universal truth about idealism and empiricism, which apply in every particular instance of right and left opportunism. That was a reading of the Encyclopedia of Anti-Revisionism Online, JC Communist Federation of Britain, their summary of On Practice. I hope you like that. If you did, feel free to support my content. You can do so in a lot of different ways, and I appreciate it all. Thank you. If you're watching live, stick around. If you are listening or watching the replay, I'll be back next time with a reading and discussion of On Practice. That should be tomorrow. All right, folks, that's going to be it for today. Thank you for being with me. Be good. Be good to yourself. Be good to each other. Safety first and teamwork. All power to all the people. Free all political prisoners. Repeat after me. I am a revolutionary. We'll see you next time when I read On Practice. Thank you.